What's going on, guys? Welcome back. In this video, we are going to be getting started with how to implement grids in SwiftUI. So let me just show you what we're going to be able to accomplish by the end of this video. We're going to be building out something that looks just like this. And this is very similar to what you'd see in an app like Instagram, where they display like a list of posts in this awesome grid format. And we're going to be able to accomplish this pretty easily in SwiftUI. So we're going to start with some of the basics of grids and how to use them before we get into creating this awesome UI that we see here. So let's go ahead and get started by creating a new module. So I am going to create a new group, guys. Call it grids. Move it underneath scroll views. Create a new SwiftUI view and call it grids module. Perfect. Okay. So let's go over getting started. Let's just jump right into it. So first thing we're going to do, guys, is add something called a lazy V grid. So this is going to be a container view that arranges its child views in a grid that grows vertically, creating items only as needed. And we're going to select this option here with the two initialization parameters. And that is going to be the columns and the content. So guys, what we're going to do is create this grid items array in just a little bit. For now, let's just go ahead and tab over to content and hit enter. And then we're just going to delete this code placeholder. And we'll go over what to put inside of the grid in just a little bit. I want us to create these columns and talk about what they are. So the reason we have to create these columns is because this tells SwiftUI how to render your grid. So you have to specify the number of columns that you want your grid to have. So for example, in the completed thing that we're going to build, this has 3 columns, right? And then we can individually size each item as we see fit, but the grid has 3 columns. So let's go ahead and create this grid item array and pass it into our lazy V grid. So we're going to say let columns be an array of grid items, and we are going to say equals and open up these brackets. And you guys are just going to say dot init, and dot init. So the reason we can just say dot init, guys, is because we've casted it as an array of grid items. If you didn't do this and just specified it to be like a blank array, you would have to specifically like specify that you want it to be a grid item. Tomato, it doesn't really matter how you do it. It's really just personal preference. And lucky for us, we can initialize these as with blank initializers like this. We don't have to do anything further, although we are going to go over some of the custom types of columns or grid items that we can use in these grids here. Let's just go ahead and pass this in here for now. And we are going to use a for loop here, guys, to create a bunch of grid items. So we can see here how we're utilizing things from past modules like we have been throughout this bootcamp. That's going to continue on. So we're going to use a for each loop. And let's go ahead and maybe just create like, I don't know, 50 grid items. We're going to say ID \self item in, and you can call this whatever you want. And then let's just go ahead and create like a rectangle and say .frame is width and height of 100 by 100. So you guys will notice that this looks pretty good, right? Like we have this awesome looking grid of all these grid items, and we have exactly 3 columns. If I were to take one of these out, it would automatically adjust to have 2 columns. Just let the preview load and do its thing. It does look a little weird, and that's because our grid expands beyond the bounds of our screen. So very similar to what we did in the last video, guys. Like if I click on this, you guys can see that the grid goes beyond the bounds of the screen. You guys should be able to guess that if we place this in a scroll view, that will solve that problem and make this a scrollable list. So if you just command click onto lazy V grid, quick shortcut to do this, guys, is you can say embed in any one of these stacks and just replace that with scroll view. And now we have, if we hit play back on that, we have this scrollable list of grid items. And let me comment that back in to get 3 of them. And that looks really good, right? And you guys can add like as many grid items as you want. And you'll see here, that's what it looks like with 4 grid items. But if we were to try to add a 5th, you guys will notice something interesting. You're going to notice that this just turns into like one big blob of things. And that's because we're specifically setting the frame to be 100 by 100, and it can't fit all of that on the screen. So let's take a look at what would happen if we just deleted that, guys. You guys will notice that it automatically just like gives it a default height, and it fits these grid items or adjusts the width of them to fit the screen. And I could just keep going, right? I could say .init, and it's going to just automatically adjust the width of my grid items to fit all of them within the screen. And you guys will notice I could give this just a height of maybe 100, and that's sort of how it will look. So the grid is very adaptive and it's very responsive to different screen sizes, which is really, really nice for us, right? And we have a lot more customization here as well. So we have a couple of different options when we create these grid items, guys. If you go inside of one of the parentheses and hit dot, you guys will notice that there's a couple different cases or different types of grid items that we can build. We can build an adaptive one, we can build one with a fixed size, or we can build one with a flexible size. So if I go here and I say dot fixed of 100, you guys will notice that this might look a little different here in a second, right? So this says, okay, the first item in this grid guy has to have a height or a fixed size of 100. In this case, it's really just the width. Like I could make the height whatever I want. Let's see. Sometimes the preview like crashes. Right, so now it's like I can make the height whatever I want, but because I'm trying to fit this grid in the screen, this is going to say, hey, it basically has a fixed height of 100. And I could make this maybe, 150, and it'll expand it even further. And I could do that on another item, right? Like I could go here and say like dot fixed and maybe do like 80. And the preview isn't being nice to me, but I think you guys get the idea, right? It's going to make one of those other grid items in here a little bit bigger, right? And it will adapt your grid to fit that size. So let's see if we can just play around with this a little bit more and have some more fun. So let me just delete this stuff. We can also say like dot adaptive, guys. And this will give me an adaptive grid item, and I can set the minimum height for it. So I can say, hey, it's adaptive, but it has to be at least this big. So I could say it has a minimum height of maybe 50. I think, yeah. Okay, so that looks good. And then, it's not going to look too different, but like you guys get the idea. You can have adaptive items, you can have flexible items as well. So like, let me delete some of these guys. And let's just stick to maybe 3 of the items here. And let's make one of these guys flexible. So let's say flexible. And let's see what that looks like. And I think flexible has some options here. Minimum of, let's say, like 300. And maximum of 400. So you guys can play around with this sort of infinitely, right? Like you can create really custom grids with something like you might see in Pinterest or even the Instagram Explore feed. There are custom grid items with custom heights, and this gives you an idea of how you can accomplish that, right? So this flexible guy behaves very similar to a spacer in that it sort of fills empty space, and then you can specify minimum and maximum heights. We're not going to do too much more of a deep dive into grids. It really depends on the UI you're trying to build. I think that definitely gives you guys some good exposure as to how they work and the different options that you can build out with these columns here. This is where it's important to understand what's going on, right? We have a scroll view. We create this lazy V grid. We supply it with some columns. We can customize those columns as we see fit. And then this is the content of that grid. And you're typically going to use a for each loop if you're displaying some like scrollable list of grid items here. You don't have to, but that's typically what you're going to do. So guys, now that we've gotten some exposure to that, let's see if we can go ahead and build out this guy here. So let's just see if we can figure out the math behind getting the grid items to fit 3 across the screen like that. And we're going to make this adaptive to different screen sizes. And then we are going to drop in all of our driver images into that grid as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we're going to do is delete the minimum and maximum guy. And we're going to make all of these flexible. So we make all of them flexible so that they can adapt to different screen sizes, right? And the height and the width is what the height is what we need to figure out here. So we're going to say, let dimension equal, and let me show you guys how to figure out the width of your screen. We're going to say parentheses UI screen dot main dot bounds dot width. So this here will give me the width of my screen, right? No matter what device I'm using, whether it's an iPad, an iPhone Pro Max, a regular iPhone, this will always give me the width of my screen. So this is pretty helpful here. And we want 3 items, right? And we want all of these to be squares. So there is some math involved here, and we're going to figure this out. So if we want 3 items across the screen, we're going to say that we want this dimension, or the dimension of each item, to be the width of the screen divided by 3, right? And then we are going to replace this with our dimension, right? So that looks pretty good. However, our spacing is still just a little bit off. So really quickly, guys, let's go over how we can adjust this so that we get that very, very minimal amount of spacing between each item, right? Very similar to what we see like here. It's a much cleaner design, and it's going to give you guys an idea of how to further customize your grids and get the spacing that you would like. So it's actually not that hard, right? So our lazy V grid here has a spacing parameter very similar to a VStack, right? So we can control the spacing between rows with that. So if I go here and say spacing 1, you guys will notice it shrinks the spacing to 1 pixel between rows. If I did like 16, it would just spread my grid out, or each row of my grid, by 16 pixels, just like that. But we just want 1, right? So let's go ahead and resume our preview. And the only other thing we have to fix, guys, is the spacing between grid items. So we can do that up in our columns definition. So I can go and in my init, right after the 2 parentheses for the flexible grid item, you can say spacing 1. And then we can just add that to the next grid item as well. And you guys will notice how that fills out perfectly, right? That's why having this flexible grid item is so helpful here. We really just need to figure out the height of the grid item. So we can say spacing 1, and we'll see how that looks. And that looks really, really good to me, right? And guys, we don't need to apply spacing to this guy simply because there is nothing next to it, right? Like if you apply another spacing of 1 here, I'm pretty sure it's not going to do anything, right? Because there's nothing next to it. When we apply it to these 2, this one has this next to it, this one has this next to it, which is why we say that we want 1 pixel of spacing between the items. And then this guy controls the spacing between rows right here. So that looks really good, right? That was so easy to put together. It just involved a little bit of math, which wasn't too bad. Now, guys, what we want to do is just grab all of the driver image names. And we had that, I believe, from another module. I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in here. So we have all of our driver image names right here. And guys, instead of looping through 0 to 50, we are just going to say driver. And then we're going to say driver in. And we notice that that is looking good. It creates 9 items for us, and we're looking good. Now, what we need to do is just create an image with that driver. So we're going to say image driver. Obviously, that's going to look terrible. We need to resize it, right? And slowly coming together, it still looks like trash though. We just need to make sure that we explicitly set the frame and stuff of it. So we're going to say dot scaled to fill, because that's the aspect ratio we want for our images. And then we are going to say dot frame height is our dimension. And then we are going to say, oops, dot clip shape is a rectangle. So that's not looking too bad, right? So something that we'll notice, guys, is that Daniel Ricciardo is being an asshole here, right? He's sort of bleeding over into the edges of the other photos. So let's see if we can fix that. I believe if you guys were to remove the scale to fill, it would adjust and it would fit correctly. But then you notice the aspect ratio here is a little bit off, right? So if we comment that back in, that's like the correct aspect ratio for his image. And in order for us to make sure that it fits within this frame, we can just specifically specify the width of it as well. And it can just be equal to this dimension right here. And you guys will notice that that solves our problem. And now we have an even 1 pixel of spacing between all of our items, and it looks really good. If you guys wanted just a little bit of spacing on the edges, like if we wanted to add 1 pixel of spacing on the left and right side of our grid, what we could do is go here and say .padding .horizontal and literally just give it 1 pixel. And that will sort of give us the spacing we want on the edges here. But now you guys notice that because of that, our images don't have the spacing between them from column to column. And to fix that, because we just added 2 pixels of space on either side, or it was 1 pixel of space on either side, 1 + 1 = 2. If we just subtracted 2 from our dimension, guys, you'll notice that everything should look good. Yep, so that looks perfect, right? And let me just add a note here to remember that why we did that. So we can say subtract 2 when we add 1 pixel of spacing on each horizontal edge, right? So that should make sense to you if you guys think about it. We added a pixel on the left and a pixel on the right of spacing. So we had to adjust the dimension of our grid item by subtracting 2 to account for that. Similarly, if I did 2 pixels of horizontal padding, let's see, I'm not sure if that's adjusting, but I think you guys get the idea here. So that just gives you guys a detailed breakdown on how to create a really amazing adaptive grid for your user interfaces. So this would literally fit on any phone size, any screen size, and you guys could verify that by like testing this out on different phone sizes, right? So I just selected 14 Pro Max and it will adjust my preview. Let's go ahead and take a look just to make sure that that works with a different sized phone, a larger phone in particular. And for some reason, guys, my preview is not loading the iPhone 14 Pro. So what I went ahead and did was just launch the app on 2 different versions of the simulator, the iPhone 14 and the iPhone 14 Pro Max. I'll show you guys how to do that in a second. And you guys can see here that my grid is adapting beautifully to both screen sizes, and the iPhone 14 Pro Max is obviously a larger phone and everything looks as expected. So that's a beautiful adaptive grid that we have created there. If you guys want to launch the app and have it open up to our grids module, all you need to do is go to the app file up here and replace content view with grids module, select the simulator that you want to run the app on and hit Command R or play, and it will run it on that device. And then you guys can compare the different grids on whatever device sizes that you like. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.